This isn't working. I need someone who matches my ambition.
You'll regret those words. Sooner than you think.
He told her she was never enough, and he believed every word of it. Isabelle Hartwell stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever shared with her husband, watching him zip the last bag closed, and she said nothing, because there was nothing left to say to a man who had already made up his mind about who she was. Nathaniel Cross did not look back at her when he spoke. He said he needed a life with more ambition in it, more shine, more proof that he had made something of himself. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the woman he was walking away from could have bought the company he worked for, the building it sat in, and every name on the letterhead above his own, and still had more left over than he would earn in 3 lifetimes. That single fact, buried under years of quiet modesty and a name she had chosen never to use, is the reason this story does not end where most stories like it do. In a downtown law office 3 weeks later, a folder sat sealed with a wax stamp bearing a family crest most people in that city would recognize instantly if they ever saw it. Inside it was Isabelle's real inheritance, waiting for a signature. The attorney who held it, a careful man named Thomas Reyna, had promised her late father he would guard the secret until the day she was ready to claim it. He had no idea that the day would arrive just weeks after her husband decided she wasn't worth staying for. So this is a story about timing, about the strange cruelty of a truth arriving just late enough to break a man's heart in a way he never saw coming. It is about a woman who spent a decade being underestimated by the one person who was supposed to know her best, and a man who wanted more out of life without ever realizing how much more was already sitting across the breakfast table from him every single morning. Before we go further into what happened the night everything changed, ask yourself something. What would you do if the person who called you not enough found out, all at once, exactly how much you were always worth? There are 3 questions worth holding on to as this story unfolds, because the answers will not come easily, and they will not come in the order you expect. The first is why a woman with access to a fortune large enough to reshape an entire city chose instead to live in a modest apartment, work as a part-time bookkeeper, and let her own husband believe she came from nothing. The second is what Nathaniel actually understood about his wife in the years they spent together, and whether the man who left her ever truly saw her at all. The third, and perhaps the cruelest, is whether the woman he left her for knew what she was really competing against, or whether she too was chasing a version of a man who did not exist. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back to where Isabelle came from, long before Nathaniel Cross ever entered her life. Her father, a man named Walter Hartwell, built a shipping and logistics empire from almost nothing, starting with 2 trucks and a handshake deal that most people told him would fail within a year. It did not fail. It grew into one of the largest privately held companies on the eastern seaboard, and along the way, he learned something that shaped every decision he made afterward. Money changes the way people look at you before they ever get the chance to know you. He watched partners flatter him for contracts, watched acquaintances soften around him the moment they learned his net worth, and he made a private vow that his daughter would never grow up inside that kind of distortion. She would be raised under her mother's maiden name in ordinary schools, in an ordinary neighborhood, far from the offices and boardrooms that carried her father's real name on the wall. Walter visited on weekends, taught her to balance a checkbook before she ever learned what a shareholder was, and told her again and again that character revealed itself only in the absence of money, never in its presence. She grew into a woman who noticed things other people missed, who could sit in a room and read exactly who wanted something from her and who simply wanted her company, because she had spent her whole childhood watching her father sort the two apart. That instinct would eventually save her, though not before it cost her nearly everything she thought she wanted. Isabelle's early adult life looked, from the outside, entirely unremarkable, which was exactly the point. She studied accounting at a mid-sized state school, took a modest apartment near downtown, and built a small, steady career doing bookkeeping for a handful of local businesses. She did not chase titles or recognition. She built friendships slowly, trusted carefully, and found genuine comfort in a smaller life than the one she was technically entitled to. Her closest friend during those years was a woman named Grace Ellery, a nurse she had met in a community yoga class, and the two of them built the kind of friendship that survives every version of a person, the successful ones and the struggling ones alike, because it was never built on either. When Isabelle met Nathaniel in her late 20s, she recognized in him a hunger she had spent her whole life trying to avoid, a need to be seen as important, to be validated by the size of the life he built around himself. He was charming in the specific way ambitious people often are, full of plans and certainty about where his career was heading. She loved him anyway, in the way people often love the parts of someone that will eventually hurt them the most. In the early years of their marriage, there was real affection between them, quiet mornings and shared jokes, and the particular closeness of two people building something from very little, at least on paper, in a one-bedroom apartment neither of them ever complained about, at least not yet. Nathaniel worked in business development for a mid-sized logistics firm, a detail that would later feel almost unbearably ironic, given the industry his wife's family had quietly built an empire inside without his knowledge. He was good at his job, well-liked by his managers, but perpetually convinced that recognition was arriving too slowly. He watched colleagues get promoted, watched acquaintances buy houses in neighborhoods he could not yet afford, and each time it happened, something in him tightened a little further. Isabelle noticed the shift in him long before it became a real problem. The comments about coworkers who had, in his words, actually made something of their lives, the sharper tone when a vacation had to be postponed, the restlessness that crept into ordinary evenings. She told herself it was a passing frustration, the kind every marriage moves through during the years when careers feel slower than expected and bills feel larger than planned. She did not yet understand that Nathaniel had begun quietly measuring his own worth against the wrong scale entirely, comparing his modest, honest life to the curated, filtered version of success he saw in everyone around him. Grace noticed it too. On the nights the three of them had dinner together, the way Nathaniel's jokes had started carrying a small edge to them, the way he talked more about where he was headed than where he currently stood. She mentioned it once to Isabelle, gently, over coffee, and Isabelle waved it away the way people often wave away the first real warning sign of something they are not ready to face. The turning point, though neither of them recognized it as one at the time, came during a company retreat Nathaniel attended without Isabelle, a 3-day conference meant to bring together regional offices for strategy sessions and force team-building exercises. It was there that he met Vivian Sinclair, a marketing executive from the company's downtown office, a woman whose confidence, wardrobe, and easy fluency in the language of ambition represented everything Nathaniel had begun to feel his own life was missing. Vivian did not set out to destroy a marriage. She was, in her own mind, simply a woman who noticed a man paying attention to her, offering the kind of admiration she had grown used to expecting from people who wanted to be near her success. What began as harmless conversation over conference dinners slowly became something else entirely over the following months. First through messages that Nathaniel told himself were purely professional, then through a second work trip that required, according to him, several late evenings of preparation together. He told Vivian things about his home life that were technically true, but deeply unfair, painting Isabelle as someone who lacked drive, who was content to stay small while he was destined for more. It was easier to tell that story than to admit the truth, which was that his wife had never once asked him to be anyone other than who he already was, and somehow that acceptance had started to feel like a cage instead of a gift, a quiet accusation he had never actually been given. By the time a full year had passed since that first retreat, the late nights at the office had grown longer, and the excuses had grown thinner, and Isabelle, even as Grace gently warned her over dinner one more time that something had changed in Nathaniel, chose to believe the version of her marriage she needed to be true. She told herself he was under pressure at work. She told herself the distance was temporary, the natural friction of two people in their 30s trying to figure out where their lives were headed. She had no real reason yet to imagine that her husband had already begun building an entire second life around a woman who represented everything he believed, wrongly, that his marriage had failed to give him. The night everything broke open began like an ordinary Tuesday, which is often how the worst nights begin. Nathaniel came home later than usual, and before Isabelle could even ask about his day, he told her he was leaving. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her of anything dramatic. He simply said, in the calm, rehearsed tone of a man who had been building toward this moment for months, that he needed a partner who wanted more out of life than she did, someone who matched the ambition he felt burning inside him. He told her she had never wanted more, that she had always been content to settle, and that he could no longer settle alongside her. He packed with an efficiency that suggested he had rehearsed this exact scene in his mind more than once, folding shirts he had clearly already decided he would need, leaving behind the smaller things without a second glance, as though the apartment itself, and everything they had built inside it, had already stopped mattering to him weeks ago. Isabelle stood near the kitchen counter and listened, and somewhere in the middle of his explanation, she stopped hearing the specific words and started hearing only the shape of them, the outline of a man convincing himself that leaving was an act of courage rather than an act of abandonment. She did not know, standing there absorbing what he believed was an honest verdict on their marriage, that an unopened letter from Thomas Reyna was already sitting on the counter behind her, waiting to prove exactly how wrong he was. Isabelle did not cry in front of him. She had learned long ago from watching her father navigate a lifetime of people trying to read his reactions in boardrooms and negotiations, how to hold her composure, even when everything inside her wanted to break completely. She asked him only one question before he reached the door, whether there was someone else, and he paused just long enough to answer it without actually answering it, a pause that told her everything his careful sentences had been avoiding for the last 20 minutes. He left without confirming it directly, as though the omission somehow made the betrayal smaller, and she watched through the front window as his car pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the street, taking with it every version of the future she had quietly assumed she was building. It was only after the door closed behind him, after the sound of his car faded into the ordinary noise of the street outside, that Isabelle allowed herself to sit at the kitchen table and finally open the letter that had been waiting for her for nearly a week. A letter she had avoided, out of some instinct that once she opened it, an entirely different chapter of her life would begin, whether she was ready for it or not. Thomas Reyna's handwriting was formal, careful, and unmistakably final. Her father's full estate, held for years in a trust structured specifically to shield her identity from public record, had fully vested to her upon the closing of a decade-long transition period, making her, quietly and without a single headline, one of the wealthiest women on the entire eastern seaboard. She read the letter twice before the words fully settled, and when they did, they arrived alongside a grief so specific it nearly doubled her over at the kitchen table, because the two events had collided in a way that felt almost engineered by some cruel version of fate. The husband who had just told her she lacked ambition had walked out of the apartment less than an hour before she learned she controlled a fortune large enough to reshape entire industries. She called Grace that night, not to celebrate, but because she needed one person in the world who would understand both halves of what had just happened to her at once, the devastating and the unbelievable, arriving within the same 60 minutes of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. Grace arrived within the hour, and the two of them sat together until well past midnight, Isabelle alternating between quiet tears and a strange, disbelieving laughter that came from somewhere neither of them could fully name. Grace, being the only other person who now knew the full truth, asked the obvious question almost immediately. Was Isabelle going to call Nathaniel back, to tell him what he had just walked away from before the divorce papers were even filed? Isabelle sat with the question for a long time before answering it, staring at the letter still resting on the table between them, and when she finally spoke, her answer surprised even herself. She said no, not yet, and possibly not ever, because some part of her needed to know what her life looked like without him before she let this truth become the reason he might want to stay. What Isabelle chose to do next surprised everyone who thought they knew her, including Grace, who half expected her to march straight to Nathaniel's new apartment and let the truth land, like a verdict he could never argue with. Instead, Isabelle chose silence. She let the divorce proceed exactly as Nathaniel had set it in motion, without objection, without revealing what she now knew about the fortune quietly sitting in her name, signing the paperwork with the same composure she had shown the night he left. She was not protecting him from the truth. She was protecting herself, taking the time she needed to understand who she was becoming before she let the rest of the world, including the man who had just walked out on her, catch even a glimpse of it. Thomas Reyna guided her carefully through those first months, explaining the scope of what she now controlled, introducing her gradually to board members and executives who had spent years operating under her father's leadership, without ever meeting the daughter who would eventually inherit it all. It was, in its own way, an entirely new education, learning to read boardrooms the way she had once read her husband's late nights, learning to separate the people who wanted to know her from the people who had simply learned what she was worth. Grace watched this transformation unfold with a mixture of pride and quiet worry, checking in constantly, making sure the woman rebuilding her public identity had not lost the private one underneath it, the one who still preferred quiet mornings to galas and boardrooms. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Nathaniel moved forward with Vivian at his side, building the life he had always believed he deserved, telling friends and coworkers that he had finally found a partner who matched his ambition. They moved into a newer apartment together within a few months, one with better views and a higher price tag, and Nathaniel found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely proud of the life he was constructing. He told colleagues at work that leaving his marriage had been the hardest decision of his life, but ultimately the right one, framing it as an act of self-honesty rather than what it actually was, and most of them, not knowing any better, believed him entirely. Vivian, for her part, settled comfortably into the relationship, enjoying the version of Nathaniel who seemed lighter now, more confident, more willing to talk about the future in specific terms rather than vague ambition. She did not know much about his ex-wife, beyond the story Nathaniel had told her. A quiet, unambitious woman who had never wanted the kind of life he was capable of building, and she had no reason to question that story, because nothing in her interactions with the world had ever suggested it might not be true. The two of them hosted a small housewarming a few months into living together, and Nathaniel, more than a little proud, told friends gathered in the kitchen that he had finally found someone who understood what it meant to want more out of life. Months passed in this quiet, parallel fashion, Isabelle stepping deeper into a world of boardrooms and quarterly reports she had spent her entire life avoiding, and Nathaniel settling comfortably into a new relationship built on a version of the past that was only partially true. Grace, during one of their regular dinners, gently raised the question again, whether Isabelle had any plans to let the truth surface publicly, and Isabelle admitted that Thomas Reyna had begun preparing exactly that, not as an act of revenge, but simply because a company the size of the one she now led could not remain hidden behind an assumed identity forever. There was, she explained, an industry gala scheduled in the coming weeks where she would formally be introduced as the new head of the Hartwell Holding Company, and there was no way to keep that quiet even if she had wanted to. The gala itself became the turning point the entire story had been building toward from the very first scene. It was held in a downtown hotel ballroom, filled with exactly the kind of people Nathaniel had always wanted to impress: executives, investors, and reporters covering the regional business circuit for outlets that mattered to people in his industry. Isabelle arrived with Thomas Reyna and Grace, wearing the quiet, understated confidence that had defined her entire life. And when she was introduced on stage as the new leader of a company whose logistics network Nathaniel's own employer relied on for a significant portion of its shipments, the room applauded in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine respect. Photographs from that night circulated quickly through industry publications and local business press the following morning, her name printed clearly beneath images of her shaking hands with people whose approval Nathaniel had spent years trying to earn. It did not take long for the story to reach him. He was scrolling through his phone at home, Vivian beside him on the couch, when a colleague sent him an article with a message that simply read, "Is this your ex-wife?" And Nathaniel opened the link, expecting some kind of mistake, some coincidence of a shared name, only to find Isabelle's unmistakable face staring back at him from a headline about the company his own career had quietly depended on for years without his knowledge. The moment the truth landed, something in Nathaniel's understanding of his own choices collapsed all at once, in a way that felt less like shock and more like the slow, sickening realization that every justification he had built for himself over the past year had been standing on ground that was never actually there. He thought back to every complaint he had made about their small apartment, every comment about her lack of ambition, every quiet accusation that she had settled for less, when in fact, she had been the one giving him a life built on genuine love rather than the size of a bank account, while never once asking him to prove himself to her the way he had spent their entire marriage, silently resenting her for not doing to him. Vivian read the same headline over his shoulder, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence in that apartment saying more than either of them could have put into words. She asked him eventually, in a voice quieter than he had heard from her before, whether he had known, and Nathaniel's answer, delivered with genuine disbelief, only made things worse, because the truth was, he had genuinely never known, which meant he had spent years dismissing a woman who had quietly outmatched every version of success he had ever chased her away in pursuit of. Vivian sat with that for the rest of the night, watching the man beside her scroll through article after article, and something in the way he stared at those photographs told her more about his priorities than any conversation between them ever had. Nathaniel tried to reach Isabelle in the days that followed, first through messages she did not answer, then through phone calls that went straight to voicemail, and finally in person, showing up unannounced at the offices of Thomas Reyna, with the same practiced confidence he once used to justify leaving her. He told the receptionist he simply wanted to talk, that there had clearly been a misunderstanding between him and his ex-wife that deserved a real conversation, and he waited nearly 40 minutes before Thomas Reyna himself came out to meet him, not to deliver a message from Isabelle, but to deliver one entirely his own. He told Nathaniel, calmly and without a trace of cruelty, that the woman he was hoping to speak with had already said everything she needed to say the night he chose to leave her, and that nothing waiting in that lobby was going to change what had already been decided. Vivian's unraveling happened more quietly, in the weeks that followed, in small conversations that grew increasingly strained as she began to understand exactly what she had actually been part of. She had built her relationship with Nathaniel on the belief that he represented ambition and forward motion, a man moving towards something bigger than the life he had left behind. Watching him spiral through disbelief and quiet obsession over a woman who no longer wanted anything to do with him, chasing headlines about a fortune he would never have any real claim to, she began to understand that the man she had chosen had never actually been building anything of his own at all. He had simply been waiting, without fully realizing it himself, to attach his identity to someone else's success. And once that illusion broke apart, so did whatever fragile foundation had been holding the two of them together in the first place. Within a few months, Vivian was gone too, leaving quietly and without the dramatic confrontation Nathaniel had perhaps expected, simply informing him one evening that she no longer recognized the man she had moved in with, a man who talked more about his ex-wife's new life than he ever talked about building one of his own. Nathaniel found himself, for the second time in under a year, standing in an empty apartment watching someone he had built a life around walk out the door. Except this time, there was no letter waiting on any counter to soften the blow, no hidden fortune to make sense of the loss, only the slow, uncomfortable realization that he had spent years measuring his worth by everyone else's applause instead of by the quiet, steady love he had once been lucky enough to have and had thrown away entirely on his own. Isabelle, for her part, did not spend her new life chasing anything resembling revenge or dwelling on what Nathaniel had lost in the process of losing her. She rebuilt everything on her own terms, with Grace at her side through every board meeting and every late-night phone call, and Thomas Reyna guiding her through a world she had spent her whole life deliberately avoiding, stepping fully into her father's legacy, while carrying forward the same quiet, grounded values he had raised her to protect from the very beginning. She expanded parts of the company into community-focused logistics programs her father had once dreamed about but never had time to build, and she made a point of never once mentioning Nathaniel publicly, letting the truth of that gala night speak entirely for itself without her help. She did not need Nathaniel to understand what he had thrown away, because the truth had already done that work for her, more completely and more publicly than any confrontation between the two of them ever could have managed. Grace, watching her closest friend settle into a life that finally matched the scale of who she had always secretly been, often reflected privately that the greatest twist in the entire story was not the money itself, but the fact that Isabelle had never once needed it to know her own worth, and that the money had simply confirmed, loudly and undeniably, what she had believed quietly about herself the entire time, long before her husband ever gave her a reason to prove it to anyone at all. What remains, long after the headlines faded and the gossip in that industry settled into something closer to legend, is a simple, uncomfortable question worth sitting with, long after this story ends. How many people walk away from something extraordinary simply because they never took the time to truly see what was standing quietly in front of them the whole time, choosing instead to chase a version of success measured entirely by other people's applause? Nathaniel had a decade to learn who his wife really was, and he spent it looking everywhere except directly at her, and by the time the truth finally arrived, it did not arrive as an opportunity to fix anything. It arrived only as proof of exactly what he had lost, delivered in the most public, undeniable way possible. Would you have recognized the signs before the money ever entered the picture? Or would you, like Nathaniel, have needed a headline to finally understand who you were living beside every single day? Let us know in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most, whether you think Isabelle made the right choice by staying quiet for as long as she did, and whether you believe a man like Nathaniel ever truly deserved the chance to know the truth at all. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.